Welcome to the Refugee Workforce podcast. This is Chris Chancey, and I get to be joined today by Seye over in the UK. Just so excited to have you with me to talk through some of the most frequently asked questions we get when we connect with companies about employing refugees, whether that be in the UK or here in the US. There are some standard questions that continue to pop up. So we thought we'd spend a few minutes and try to be very brief and efficient in conversation, but try to also give some practical advice and maybe some stories along the way about some of the most common questions that we hear. So Seye, so good to have you. First question we're going to tackle is, what is a refugee? So I'd love for you to just jump in and go for that. And I look forward to kind of wrapping up what you share and continuing this conversation.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Chris, for the opportunity to speak on your podcast. So my name is Seye Onabolu. I'm the founder of Sona Circle Refugee Recruitment. We're based in the UK, in London, and we operate in most of the major cities in the UK, so Birmingham, Manchester, and London. So I also I published a book earlier this year called Refugees Are Here to Stay, Get Used to It. So some of what I'll talk about is from the book and is discussed there, but a lot of it, as Chris mentioned, as you mentioned, Chris, is going to be from my experience of working with employers in the UK to help hire refugee candidates. So first question, what is a refugee? It's actually a really good question, something that we discussed quite extensively in the book, because the definition really defines how people are classified in different parts of the world. One thing I will say, I started off my experience of working with refugees by doing research and actually going to refugee camps in Greece. So on the island of Lesbos in Mytilene. So this is an island just off the coast of Turkey. And it is, I guess, the shortest point between Turkey and Europe. So it is essentially the gateway for people coming from Afghanistan, Iraq, and the Middle East through Turkey into Europe. And what we found was that the definitions of refugees varies across Europe. I'm a bit less familiar with the definitions in the US. But for example, when people first come into the country, arrive, before they get their, I guess, documentation papers, in the UK, they're classified as asylum seekers. And the classification here is quite important because in the UK, asylum seekers don't have the right to work at present within a space of, at the moment, it's about over a year. I'm part of the Lift the Ban coalition campaign that's trying to reduce that time to 6 months or less. But in that time, while they are asylum seekers, they don't have the right to work, to housing, to healthcare benefits, and other things. Whereas once they get their leave to remain, which is essentially 5 years right to work, which can be renewed, they have full and equal rights as UK citizens to employment, to housing, healthcare benefits, and so on.
Yes.
So that definition of refugees versus asylum seekers in the first instance is absolutely critical for some people in the UK. It makes a huge difference. Yeah. In Greece, for example, people are called refugees as soon as they come into the country. Other parts of Europe, the terminology differs, but it's very important to understand what they mean, and because in many cases it's the difference between being able to survive and not being able to. Yeah, there are other kind of things that go into defining a refugee. For example, the purpose of people leaving their home country. Refugees, at least according to the UNHCR terminology classification, are people that essentially have been forced to move, forcefully displaced. So this could be as a result of environmental disasters, political, civil unrest, not necessarily religious tension directly. I think that falls on political umbrella. But I think the key difference is it's people who are almost forced versus people who would rather move because of well, to somewhere that's more prosperous. So I think they would be considered economic migrants
Yeah.
as opposed to refugees.
Yeah.
Um,
Yeah. So we
please go
see,
ahead.
I just think about maybe recent events that would kind of classify. So we think about in the not too distant past, an Ebola outbreak in a certain part of Africa. So that kind of movement of people due to disease outbreak, those individuals classified as refugees. Certainly, if we look at the collapse of the government of Afghanistan, if we look at the situation in Ukraine, those situations when we think about civil unrest, forcing people to flee their home, and then even religious persecution is a UNHCR category where some people would be forced to flee in fearing for their life. And so, yeah, and I think one thing that's important for people to recognize is um, of the number of people that flee their home, whether they're fleeing and they're still within the borders of their country, or they cross that border into another nation, there's a very, very, very tiny percentage of those people that actually get resettled into a more prosperous nation, a developed economy that is welcoming them in. And that's where we start to see some of those timelines take place. Like you mentioned, for the US, it's somewhere around 1% of the 80 million plus people that would be classified as refugees around the globe that end up coming to the US. And it it's a lottery, and it's a tiny percentage. I think a lot of people miss that stat along the way. But yes, once they arrive, at least in the US, they're able to work essentially from day one. They'll get their work authorization if they are classified as a refugee, and then they have essentially the same rights that I would have as an American citizen, except they can't vote. And so after 5 years, they can take a citizenship test and become an actual U.S. citizen, and then they can participate in voting as well. And so a little bit of a different standard with every country, whether it be European or US, and even in Canada. But I do love the fact that employment is one of those factors that every nation is kind of driving and recognizes the opportunity to see, especially right now across the world, an opportunity to engage new people in their labor and their workforce. And so that's why we exist. That's why Sona Circle does the work that you do. That's why Amplio gets to play a role in employment for so many refugees. So maybe one final comment, anything you want to close with on this specific topic on your side?
Yeah, I think it's an interesting kind of discussion, especially what you said about the US taking comparatively fewer refugees into the country. That disparity exists even within Europe. You see countries like Germany that take in millions people every year, as opposed to pretty much the other countries, the UK, for example, that takes in perhaps tens of thousands per year in best case scenario. So, and again, if you look at what the countries that are taking in more people are doing and how they're managing the situation, there are a lot of highlights and positive stories. Germany, for example, has done a fantastic job at helping people integrate, and they are actually reaping the rewards of that investment. So, yeah.
Yeah, and I think we're seeing the overall policies and structure shift on a regular basis as there are certain people groups in question, and certainly proximity to those nations that are experiencing the most unrest. And so as these topics and this situation continues to be in flux, unfortunately, we recognize there's going to be more and more waves of people in need. And at the same time, it's an opportunity to support, to provide employment, and to help people rebuild and maybe even reclaim some dignity that's been lost on the journey. So grateful to get to be in a position to help with that, and grateful for the work you and your team are doing as well. So as always, if there are questions, if there's interest in connecting, whether it be for employment for refugees or just in general looking for more information on the topic, feel free to grab either of our books. and also just reach out, and happy to connect and provide any resources and support that we can. So Seye, thanks for being with us today, and I look forward to continuing to produce content that can be short and brief and hopefully informational and provide value to our listeners. Thank you.
Amazing. Thank you so much, Chris.